All right, here's part two of the lecture on ethics. Yeah, I was. We left off talking about this picture taken at University of California at Berkeley, Cal Memorial Hospital, and this is where there was a psychologist who got himself into a little bit of trouble, even though he thought that he was doing the absolute right thing. The case of Tatiana Tarasov is one that has been written up about on several occasions, and there are really good articles that have been written about it. In fact, even the basic Wikipedia article about the case is one that's worthwhile and worth looking into. Um, the subsequent slide actually shows a picture of Tatiana Tarasov and the man who took her life, which was a guy that she dated a few times and tried to break it off with him and did end the relationship that they had had. What had happened was this gentleman named Padar had gone in to see a psychologist at UC Berkeley. And what had happened is that he had talked to him about his frustration over the fact that he was dating this woman, Tatiana Tarasov. She had broken it off with him. And he was really immensely frustrated by the fact that she wouldn't see him again. And his anger said to the psychiatrist, or in this case I think it was actually a psychologist, that he was planning on taking Tatiana Tarasov's life. The rules were a little bit more sketchy about what a therapist's obligations were back then, and the psychologist decided he was going to call campus police. And he called campus police, and they kind of checked the situation out. And if memory serves correctly, didn't find very much evidence to go on. And then I think a certain amount of time elapsed, and he came back to the therapist and said that he was going to do this again, and called campus police again. And but crucially, he did not call Tatiana Tarasov or her family to warn her about this guy. The therapist had thought that he had done due diligence and had contacted the appropriate people because of this guy who was clearly mentally disturbed and violent and deranged, and thought that that was going to be enough protection. So in fact, he did end up killing Tatiana Tarasov. And the family of Tatiana Tarasov sued the regents of the University of California, so in effect the state of California that owned University of California at Berkeley and all the other UC schools, for liability that he should have warned. And so there was a series of appeals, and it went all the way to the state of California Supreme Court. What ended up happening was what's called the duty to warn law. So in this situation, when there is an imminent danger of an identifiable person, an imminent threat to an identifiable person, it is the therapist's obligation not just to contact the authorities, but to contact the would-be victim or the would-be victim's family to warn of possible danger. So that's what came out of that, and that is all mandated reporters have to abide by that rule, what's called the duty to warn. And that came about because of the case of Tatiana Tarasov. And so here are some of the other exceptions that we talked about in part one of this lecture. When a client is in imminent danger to self or others or is gravely disabled, in cases of child, elder, or dependent abuse, including incest, rape, or abuse, if the child is under the age of 16, and in the case of elders or dependents, the financial abuse in those situations. So if you know of an elderly person who may have diminished capacity and they are being taken advantage of by someone else who's preying upon them and victimizing them, that is a mandated report. If the client needs hospitalization. And then one last one we didn't go through, which is if the records are subpoenaed or ordered by a court. For the most part in the state of California, if the records that you're keeping on a client are subpoenaed by a court, you have the right to refuse to cooperate with the subpoena without any legal ramifications. And you can do that citing confidentiality rules. However, if a court orders you to release records, you can be found liable and punished, although from my understanding, it very rarely happens. But if a court orders you to release records and do not cooperate, you could be arrested. I actually have never met a psychologist to whom that has ever happened. Most of the time, if it goes to a court order, part of the informed consent process is that you can tell clients that you will cooperate with a court order and surrender records, and most people end up going ahead and signing off on that as part of the informed consent process. I think only once have I ever had records subpoenaed, and I did not cooperate with that, citing confidentiality, and they did not order me to surrender the records. The records remained locked up tight. Okay, moving on down now to slide number 11. When we're talking about here, you see these letters DX and AX. That just refers to diagnosis and assessment. It's kind of medical shorthand. And when we're talking about ethics, it is very, very important to undergo an assessment process before you make a diagnosis. And of course, this should also precede any kind of treatment that you're doing. So, a very important part of ethical treatment of patients is to go through the assessment process where you gather information about a client using reliable and valid instruments, and then go through the formal diagnosis process, and then you begin treatment. There's an old saying in the medical field and in the therapeutic fields, which is that all treatment begins with diagnosis. This is a very, very helpful saying because it helps you to not put the cart before the horse and start treating someone before you've gotten a really good understanding of where they are. In terms of counseling, most patients will try to rush the initial process and try to drive right to the heart of the problem because they usually think they've got a pretty good grasp of what the problem is. And it's very important that you don't fall for that. Definitely take your time, even if it takes you several sessions, to get at a more accurate picture of where the client actually is before you begin the treatment process. Now, of course, in that intervening time, you can be listening, you can be building trust, you can develop a strong therapeutic alliance with someone. So it's not like you're not doing some form of treatment, but before you begin your actual treatment of the client, the formal treatment process of a client, it's important that you know what you're working with diagnostically. So make sure that you have a really good intake, make sure that you have good testing materials at your disposal, make sure that you are checking in with the client periodically regarding treatment plans, make sure that you're checking in with the client regarding any kind of symptom checklists, just to get a good idea of where the client is so that you'll know what it is that you're working with when you're trying to treat a client. All diagnosis should reflect balance and honesty, and they should balance the honesty of the diagnostic process with respect for the client's well-being. You have to watch out for labeling effects. Labeling effects is when a person sees their identity as being completely inseparable from their diagnosis. You'll sometimes hear people say things like, I'm schizophrenic, as opposed to, I have schizophrenia, or I struggle with schizophrenia. So make sure that when you're diagnosing somebody, you try to do that in a way that delivers information, but that does not pathologize the person or make it sound like their identity is completely wrapped up in the diagnosis. When it comes to intelligence tests, it's really important that you don't necessarily give feedback to people just because you happen to know what their IQ score is. Obviously, if a person really wants to know their IQ score or something like this, you have to give it to them if they are the holder of privilege. But you also want to make sure that you don't just give out test results casually and informally, even if a person wants them. It's important to ask them why it's important, and it's also important to be responsible with information. Sometimes you can give information to a client, and them having that information could actually cause more harm than good. You also want to make sure that when you're diagnosing somebody that you're not overlooking the fact that sometimes when a person has a disorder, it actually is an indicator of health and not an indicator of sickness. An analogy that I'll draw is kind of like when a person has an allergic reaction to something or an immune system reaction to something. If your body has been infiltrated by a toxin, your body's natural defense mechanisms will kick into high gear, and in so doing, you will suffer from several symptoms of illness. You could become nauseous, you could become dizzy, you could feel faint, you could throw up, you might run a temperature, or have a fever. There are lots of ways in which your body gives off signs that it's fighting illness. So in a lot of cases, even though you're feeling sick, it's actually an indicator that your body is in good health, that it's fighting the illness very strongly and your immune system is working. So in the case of, let's say a person has a traumatic reaction to a stressful, traumatizing event. So let's say like they've actually been diagnosed with PTSD. That doesn't mean that there's something wrong with them. It actually could mean that there's something right with them, that they saw something that was really horrible and they had a negative reaction to it. Their body didn't like it, their brain didn't like it, their mind didn't like it, their emotions were overwhelmed, which could actually be an indicator that by and large their lives are going pretty well. So the bottom line here is when it comes to assessment, diagnosis, and treatment, make sure that it's included, that it always is a part of the process of best practices, but make sure that we give out information in a way that is humane and that does not cause further harm. It's important to normalize diagnoses. It's important for people to understand that they're not the only person in the world suffering in the way that they're suffering. Many people suffer under the delusion that they're the only one in the world who has the problem that they have. That is not true. You'll find actually that several disorders, the more you study them, you'll find that many people feel like they are all alone in the world as the only one who suffers in that exact way, when in fact there are many people who suffer in that way. So that's a very helpful thing to be able to encourage people in their road to recovery, that they're not doing it alone. Another ethical issue is to, generally speaking, avoid what are called dual or multiple relationships. A dual relationship is when a therapist assumes more than one role simultaneously in a client's life. Um, Examples could be being a supervisor and a therapist to the same person. It could also be another example. Here, let me take a quick break. My cat is meowing in the background, so I'll be right back and let the cat out. So sorry about that background noise. Thanks for your patience. Okay, the cat's outside and not making any more noise. Um, Associating socially with a patient. If you ever barter with a client, that's usually frowned upon. If you're not familiar with what barter is when you have a financial agreement that usually does not involve cash or a credit card payment. So instead, if a client says to you, let's say like your client is a massage therapist and the client is coming to you for counseling, and the massage therapist client of yours says, instead of paying you in cash, I'll give you two massage sessions for in exchange for you providing counseling. Um, Although technically bartering is not illegal, it is typically frowned upon. Now, in some cases, it might be socially appropriate to do this. Like, for example, what if you are a therapist and you are working in a very, very rural or traditional village where there might not be a lot of money in the village, but nevertheless, some form of payment would be expected to be rendered for the services that you've provided? It might be considered to be socially appropriate in some of those kinds of cases if it's not exploitative, if you're not um, taking advantage of the situation, to have someone pay you in an alternative way. Um, but again, generally speaking, it's frowned upon to engage in barter. Um, the main problem with dual relationships is that there's always the potential for exploitation. So let's go back to maybe being a therapist to someone that you are also. How about this? Let's imagine that you are a therapist, but you're also a teacher or a professor, and a student in your class comes to you for counseling. This would be a very bad idea for you to say yes to this situation, because think about what could happen. In your capacities as a therapist, it could actually cause you to evaluate negatively, or at least or positively, one way or the other. But the bottom line is that it could bias you in your evaluation of the person as a student, or vice versa. And so that's really important. Probably the most obvious example of a dual relationship would be providing any kind of counseling services to a close friend or to a family member. That is almost always considered to be an unethical thing, because the possibility for exploitation would be very, very high, and it could be potentially ruinous to a friendship or to a familial dynamic. So dual relationships, by and large, are to be avoided. Now, down here at the very bottom of this slide, you'll see this question: is this always avoidable? And you can probably guess that because I'm asking the question, that the answer is No, it's not true that these are always avoidable. There could be some situations in which a dual relationship becomes unavoidable. Let's cite the example, as is commonly cited, of a psychologist who works in a very small town. So, say, like, you live in a town that has about 700 people. It's one of those towns where everybody knows everybody else. It's one of those towns where all the kids go to the same school. Most people go to the same church. People socialize together. And now there's somebody in the town who has a major problem. Well, what are the chances that this person could get quality psychological care? Because in this case, you might be the only psychologist for miles around. What are the chances that this person could get quality psychological care without talking to somebody that he or she does not already know? So, in that case, what is advisable is that you talk about the dual relationship up front and you strategize very specifically about how you're going to handle it. It's very important to have a good exit strategy. It's very important to have a good plan for how you're going to interact with each other in public. And very important to document this situation. And I would even add that it's probably very important for you to seek out supervisory help in consultation with another therapist just to get you through it. So there have been people who've gone down that road before. It's very important. So just recognize that sometimes these cannot be avoided. As a rule, I have made a couple of exceptions, and I can talk about that with you if you'd like me to go into a little bit more detail. But as a rule, I do not counsel anybody from my church. So that's a good example of I go to a church that has about 600 or 700 members, and as a rule, I will not provide counseling services to anybody who's a member of my church because I consider my church family to be a part of my personal life. I have lots of friends there, and so that's just a decision that I've made to not do that. I will refer out to another counselor in that kind of a situation. All right, moving down to slide number 13. Other ethical principles include always practice within your bounds of competence. That's pretty obvious. You should not be providing counseling services when you don't know what it is that you're doing, or if you're using a therapeutic technique that you've not received specialized training in. It's important to practice within the bounds of your expertise and competence. You want to base your interventions on scientific knowledge and professionalism. So don't just be pulling interventions out of the air. You want to make sure that they've been well researched, well validated, and that they hold up to scientific and professional scrutiny. Another ethical issue: you cannot charge or accept money for a referral. So this is kind of interesting. My wife is in the real estate business. If one of her friends gives her a referral, it's customary in the real estate industry to get a referral fee, and that exists in a lot of other industries as well. However, in therapy, this is very much frowned upon and considered to be unethical because you do not want the person you're making the referral to, you're not wanting it to be the case that you could benefit financially from something that you should be doing in the client's best interests regardless. And so what if, for example, you only provided a referral to people who paid you a lot of money? Well, there's no guarantee that those are going to be the best therapists that you could be referring this person to. So you're not allowed to do that. Another thing, too, is that as you grow in your knowledge about psychology and about mental health and about counseling, the amount of informal, casual diagnosing that you could do is going to increase. So if you hear stories that people tell you, or if you encounter people in real life that seem a little bit odd or a little bit different, or who may be suffering from a mental illness, it's very important in these situations that you don't take advantage of the knowledge that you have and say, oh, well, I'm a psychology major, or I'm a counseling graduate student, or I'm a clinical psychologist, and that person very clearly has XYZ disorder. It's very important that you don't take advantage of that. That does give psychologists a very bad name. So armchair diagnosing people from afar is considered to be very unethical. Actually, very interestingly, something that has proliferated a lot in the last several years has been psychologists diagnosing very famous people on social media or writing journal articles about them. That is considered to be a very big no-no. It's considered to be highly unethical for you to diagnose anybody who is not under your care. So that doesn't stop a lot of therapists from making comments about, say, President Trump or something like that, or President Obama, or people who think that a president might be stupid or crazy or whatever. A very popular one, obviously, is to say that Donald Trump is a narcissist, right? It's not a stretch of the imagination to say that Donald Trump is a narcissist, and you could see why people would say that. But for a therapist to actually say that in public or write an article attesting to that fact or commenting on that on social media is considered to be very much out of bounds and unethical. After all, this person is not in your care, and so it could be thought that you're practicing outside of your realm of expertise or your scope of expertise. We've already talked about this. Please do keep meticulous, readable records that do not impugn or ruin the name of your patients. Just kind of report on what happened in counseling. Don't do a lot of moralizing in your note keeping. A good rule of thumb for keeping professional records is write enough so that the professional record is clear, but don't write so much that you would not want this record read out loud in a court of law and that it would embarrass you, or humiliate your patient. So a good rule of thumb is to always write your records as if they will one day be read by a judge. It seems kind of like a scary way to operate, but it's a very helpful way to make sure that you don't say too much in your records. Your records need to say a certain amount, but they should not reveal too much. At a minimum, a record should talk about the diagnosis that a person has, the subject that you talked about that day, the patient's overall status, how are they doing symptomatically, how are they doing in terms of attention, concentration, appearance, their verbal tone, and things like this, and then whatever interventions and treatment plans you have for that patient. Beyond that, you should not do a lot of informal diagnosing, and you certainly shouldn't make comments about the patient's character. So again, good record keeping is very, very important. Notice that I say here in this last bullet point on slide number 13 that your records must be readable. That is true. It's an obscure fact that isn't talked about a lot, but it is very much true. When you are keeping records, you must write them. If you do handwrite your notes like I do, you must write legibly and clearly so that they could be read by someone else. All right, skipping down to slide number 14. You want to document your records and keep them very secure. Your records should be kept in a locked and secure location. And records should be kept for a minimum of 10 years if you are a therapist, after you have ceased treating them. Another ethical issue, you're not allowed to solicit services when uninvited. So if you see that, this may sound like an obvious one, but we have to talk about it because people have tried to take advantage of it before. And that is that if someone is feeling depressed or dejected or despondent, and they appear to be so, you can't come up to that person and say, I'm a psychologist, would you like to come see me for some counseling sessions? Now, what you can do, and I've had to do this a couple of times, is that when a person has been in crisis, like a stranger, you're welcome to come up to them and say, excuse me, sir or ma'am, I see that you're very, very distraught. I'm a psychologist. Is there anything I can do right now to help out or point you in the right direction? That I have done on occasion. One time I had to do it on an airplane where there was a very agitated person, and the flight attendants were very grateful to me for having done that. So it's not inappropriate for you to say, hey, this is what I'm able to do in some crisis situations. But it's considered to be completely out of bounds for you to advertise your services when those have not been solicited. Very important, another ethical issue, psychologists are not to abandon their patients, so you want to ensure that they continue to get good care. It's considered to be very ethically wrong to not treat someone just because they can't afford to pay you. So yes, you are allowed to charge for your sessions, and yes, the patient is supposed to pay, and yes, there should be some sort of a plan for the patient to pay if money is running a little bit low. But if money is running a little bit low and they can't pay, that you have no right to say, okay, well then I'm not going to treat you. Bottom line is that therapists do not abandon their clients. Furthermore, you cannot withhold records because of non-payment. Other issues, you must gain institutional review board approval before doing research. So if you're going to be doing research on students or research on patients or research on people in a hospital, you have to make sure you go through the institutional review board of that organization, and all organizations have these kinds of boards. Fresno Pacific has an institutional review board. Hospitals have an institutional review board. So an IRB is just a committee of people who look at proposals written up by researchers to make sure that no harm is going to happen to the people who are being involved in the study and that they have given their consent to participate. You're not allowed to use deception unless the deception is considered to be an integral part of the research, and provided that you provide feedback to the people after you've deceived them. And of course, above all else, no harm can befall any participant in a study. So that would seem to be that some of the most famous experiments in psychology in the past definitely did not have this idea in mind. There have been some very shameful studies that have been carried out in the history of psychology that would never pass an IRB board to this day, in this day and time. If animals are to be treated in your research or involved in research, they're supposed to be treated humanely. Of course, most animals that are involved in research do end up needing to be euthanized. And so if that is the case, if they're going to have any kind of surgery done on them, that there should always be anesthesia involved, and that euthanization would be handled in the most ethical way if possible, that the death of an animal involved in research should be quick and painless. And slide number 16 and 17, these are our last two slides here in part 2 and for this lecture overall. When you are called, as the case might be, to be an expert witness given your training in a particular area, you must ensure that the opinions that you offer are influenced by sound science and comprehensive data. You're not supposed to just be a hired gun that always comes up with the same conclusion every single time just because it's convenient to the prosecution or the defense in a court case. Make sure that you interview the defendant. Make sure you go through the appropriate steps. And so this is part of making sure that people are protected from harm, and that we also protect the reputation of therapists and psychologists. What happens when you encounter an ethical dilemma? One of the first things that you should do when you happen upon a situation where you simply do not know what to do is to document your ethical dilemma. Write it down, document it, and then articulate your dilemma to trusted people. Reach out and ask for help for how to resolve this difficult issue. And you can do so in a way that maintains confidentiality. And then weigh the consequences of your actions. And then ultimately you're going to need to make a decision. Just make sure that you make a decision that tries to minimize harm and that reflects the fact that you've reached out to other people who are wise and trustworthy and have asked for help. Incidentally, not a lot of people know this, but it's a helpful thing to know, and that is if you are a marriage and family therapist, you can actually call a legal hotline where there are attorneys that, when you pay your dues to be a licensed therapist and belong to the California Association of Marriage and Family Therapists, which is called CAMFT, you can actually talk to attorneys who can advise you on how to walk through an ethical dilemma. It's a really neat feature, and I know that there are hotlines like that that exist for psychologists as well. And finally, moving down to slide number 17, you're wanting to maintain your professionalism in all spheres. You want to make sure that you're still competent in a lot of areas. I find that if you're a therapist, one of the great things you can do as a therapist is to teach, because it forces you and compels you to stay up to date and keeps you abreast of all the issues that are important for a therapist to know. Of course, if you're a therapist anyway, you're going to have to undergo 36 hours of continuing education. So you'll need 36 hours of CEUs every 2 years. So that's important. And ethics will almost always be a part of the continuing education requirement. And then you need to be able to go through those things in order to get a renewal of your license to practice. Act reasonably. Try to think about the rights of all of the people involved. Document. Keep those records. And again, the bottom line, just to review, and this is what we talked about at the top of this lecture, what people are going to want to know is, in a crisis, did you act in a timely, legal, reasonable, and conscientious manner given the information that you had available to you at the time? Would another reasonable person, given the same amount of information and put in the situation that you were put in, would a reasonable person have acted the way that you acted? That's basically what a judge and jury are going to want to know. So be very familiar with the rules, but also remember the rules aren't going to tell you every single thing about how to resolve an ethical dilemma. So it's not enough to know the rules. You also need to know how to act when the rules sometimes are vague, or when the rules conflict, or when you're just not sure what to do in an exceptional set of circumstances. So know the law and know how to serve the public best, and this is going to reflect very well upon you as a therapist.